Order in my courtroom. The wooden gavel struck the mahogany block like a death knell. Judge Harrison Caldwell smiled down at the trembling black woman in the defendant's chair, absolutely certain he was about to ruin another life. He had the forged evidence. He didn't have her real badge number. Courtroom 302 of the Superior Judicial District was a place where hope reliably suffocated. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the heavy, dust-choked blinds, casting long, barred shadows across the worn oak floors. At the center of this grim theater sat Judge Harrison Caldwell. He was a man composed of sharp angles and cold ironies, a 30-year veteran of the bench who had quietly built a fiefdom on a foundation of systemic prejudice and unquestioned authority. He was known in the back rooms of the local bar association as a hanging judge, particularly if the defendant happened to be a person of color. Today, Caldwell's target was Molly Davis. Molly sat at the defense table, her shoulders slumped beneath a cheap beige cardigan that looked entirely too thin for the aggressive air conditioning of the room. Her hands, trembling slightly, were clasped tight in her lap. To anyone observing from the gallery, she was the picture of a broken woman, a low-level accountant caught in the gears of a merciless justice system. She was facing 3 counts of wire fraud and grand larceny, accused of embezzling over $400,000 from a city-funded youth center, a crime that carried a mandatory minimum of 15 years under Caldwell's notorious sentencing guidelines. "Let the record reflect," Judge Caldwell began, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that demanded absolute silence, "that we are resuming the trial of the State versus Davis. Prosecution, are you ready to proceed with your opening statements?" Prosecutor Richard Hayes, a slick, ambitious man whose moral compass pointed strictly toward conviction rates, stood up and buttoned his tailored suit. "We are, Your Honor." "And the defense?" Caldwell didn't even look at the defense table. He was busy cleaning his reading glasses with a silk handkerchief. Michael Trent, an overworked and severely underslept public defender, stood up, clearing his throat nervously. "Ready, Your Honor. However, we would like to renew our motion to suppress the financial ledgers recovered from Miss Davis's apartment. As we stated yesterday, the search warrant lacked probable cause, and the chain of custody is severely compromised." Caldwell stopped wiping his glasses. He slowly put them on, the magnified lenses making his pale blue eyes look enormous and predatory. He leaned over the massive oak bench, staring directly at Molly before shifting his gaze to her attorney. "Mr. Trent," Caldwell said, his tone dripping with condescension, "I ruled on that motion yesterday. I am not in the habit of repeating myself simply because you are unhappy with the outcome. The evidence is admissible. We are not going to delay justice to indulge legal technicalities designed to shield a defendant who clearly couldn't resist the temptation of other people's money." He paused, letting a heavy, suffocating silence fill the room. Some people simply lack the moral constitution to handle public funds. Motion denied. Molly flinched visibly, her eyes darting to the floor. Caldwell caught the reaction, and a microscopic smirk played at the corner of his lips. He lived for that flinch. For decades, he had carefully curated a network of corrupt police officers and compliant prosecutors like Hayes to railroad defendants he deemed undesirable. He had a particular disdain for young, upwardly mobile black professionals, finding perverse joy in tearing them down from their pedestals. What Caldwell didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that Molly Davis did not exist. Beneath the cheap cardigan, beneath the terrified posture and the tear-filled eyes, was Special Agent Sarah Jenkins of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit. The trembling in her hands wasn't fear. It was the adrenaline of a hunter who had finally cornered a dangerous predator. For 2 years, the Department of Justice had been quietly receiving anonymous complaints about Caldwell's courtroom, disproportionate sentencing, evidence tampering, and whispers of cash kickbacks for private prison quotas. But Caldwell was smart. He never left a paper trail, and he completely controlled the local jurisdiction. The FBI realized that the only way to catch him was to feed him exactly what he wanted: a perfect victim. Sarah had spent 6 months building the Molly Davis identity. They set up a fake job at a real community center, funneled federal money through marked accounts, and then deliberately triggered an anonymous tip to one of Caldwell's known corrupt police contacts, Detective Bradley Higgins. Higgins took the bait, forged a search warrant, planted a doctored ledger in Sarah's fake apartment, and arrested her. Everything was going exactly to plan. Caldwell was walking blindly into a federal trap, completely unaware that the heavy, silver pendant necklace resting against Sarah's collarbone was a high-definition, micro-recording device beaming encrypted audio and video directly to a mobile command center parked 3 blocks away. "Proceed, Mr. Hayes," Caldwell ordered, leaning back in his leather chair, looking forward to the slaughter. The trial proceeded with a brutal, sickening efficiency. It was less a legal proceeding and more an execution. Hayes aggressively paraded a string of witnesses to the stand, all carefully rehearsed. First was Detective Higgins, who lied seamlessly under oath about finding the financial ledger hidden inside a heating vent in Molly's apartment. When Michael Trent attempted to cross-examine Higgins about the timeline of the raid, Caldwell immediately intervened. "Objection, Your Honor," Hayes said lazily. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "Sustained," Caldwell snapped before Trent even had a chance to argue. "Move along, Mr. Trent. The detective has already answered your question. Do not waste this court's time." Sarah sat perfectly still, her eyes downcast. Internally, she was cataloging every violation: judicial interference, deprivation of the Sixth Amendment right to confront a witness, bias on the record. The FBI audio techs in the command van were likely cheering. Caldwell was handing them a slam-dunk indictment on a silver platter. The prosecution's star witness was Arthur Penhaligon, a regional bank manager who had a notoriously cozy relationship with Caldwell's inner circle. Arthur was a nervous, sweating man who avoided looking at the defense table. "Mr. Penhaligon," Hayes paced in front of the jury box, playing to the room. "Can you tell the court who authorized the transfer of the $400,000 from the Youth Center's operational fund to an offshore account?" "It was her," Arthur said, pointing a shaking finger directly at Sarah. "Molly Davis. She brought me the authorization forms. She said it was for an emergency building acquisition." "And did you verify those forms?" I trusted her," Arthur stammered. "She was the lead accountant. But later, when I checked the signatures of the board members, I realized they were forged." Michael Trent stood up, his face red with frustration. "Objection, hearsay, and lack of foundation. The prosecution hasn't even produced these alleged forged documents." Caldwell banged his gavel. "Overruled. The witness is testifying to his direct experience. You will have your turn, counselor. Sit down." When it was Trent's turn to cross-examine, the true depths of Caldwell's corruption were laid bare. Trent approached the podium, holding a stack of bank records the FBI had specifically engineered to exonerate Molly. "Mr. Penhaligon," Trent said, "isn't it true that your personal login credentials were used to initiate the wire transfer at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday? A time when my client was on a recorded phone call with her mother in another state." Arthur paled. He looked frantically up at the judge. Before Hayes could even voice an objection, Caldwell leaned forward, his face dark with fury. "Mr. Trent, what is this document you are referencing?" "It's a digital server log from the bank, Your Honor. It proves my client couldn't have." "I have not seen this document," Caldwell interrupted, his voice echoing loudly. "This was not submitted in the pretrial discovery." "Your Honor, it was submitted as Defense Exhibit C," Trent argued, frantically flipping through his binder. "You signed the receipt of discovery yourself." "I am striking this entire line of questioning from the record," Caldwell declared loudly, ignoring Trent completely. He turned to the jury. "The jury will disregard the defense's last statement. It relies on unverified, inadmissible garbage designed to confuse you." "Your Honor," Trent shouted, finally losing his temper, "you are actively preventing me from defending my client. This is a clear violation of due process." "One more word, Mr. Trent," Caldwell warned, pointing his gavel like a weapon, "and you will spend the night in a holding cell for contempt, and your client will face this trial alone." Trent froze. He looked back at Sarah, his eyes filled with a helpless, despairing apology. He slowly took his seat. He was beaten. Caldwell settled back into his chair, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. He turned his cold eyes onto Sarah. The prosecution may rest its case, and I suggest the defense think very carefully about whether they wish to mount a futile defense or simply proceed to closing arguments so we can conclude this matter. Caldwell felt utterly invincible. He had rigged the game perfectly, just as he had dozens of times before. He looked at the quiet, trembling black woman across the room and saw only a victim. He saw another statistic to boost his tough-on-crime re-election campaign. He didn't notice the subtle shift in her posture. He didn't see that the trembling in her hands had completely stopped. Sarah looked up, meeting Judge Caldwell's gaze directly for the first time since the trial began. The terrified facade vanished, replaced by a gaze so intensely cold and analytical that Caldwell actually felt a brief, inexplicable shiver run down his spine. She reached up, her index finger lightly tapping the silver pendant on her necklace 3 times. It was the tactical signal to the FBI raid team parked outside. The trap was locked. Time to burn it down, Sarah thought. Michael Trent ran a shaking hand through his thinning hair, his spirit utterly broken by the tyrannical theater playing out before him. He stood up slowly, the fight completely drained from his posture. Your Honor, the defense. He paused, swallowing hard, unable to look at his client. The defense rests. Excellent. Judge Harrison Caldwell purred, his lips stretching into a chilling, reptilian smile. A wise decision, Mr. Trent. Given the overwhelming and, frankly, irrefutable evidence presented by the state, I see no reason to prolong this matter. We will proceed directly to closing arguments, after which I will instruct the jury. Actually, Your Honor, we won't be doing that. The voice didn't come from Michael Trent. It came from the defense table. It was clear, commanding, and completely devoid of the terrified tremor that had defined Molly Davis for the past 3 days. Caldwell's head snapped toward the table. His gavel hovered in midair. Excuse me? Did the defendant just speak out of turn? Sarah Jenkins stood up. She didn't cower. She didn't slouch. She pulled her shoulders back, shedding the meek persona of the embezzling accountant like a snake shedding its skin. She reached up and unbuttoned the top of her cheap beige cardigan, letting it slip from her shoulders to reveal a crisp, black button-down shirt underneath. Sit down, miss. Davis, Caldwell barked, his face flushing with immediate, violent anger. Your counsel has rested your case. You do not have the floor. If you speak again, I will have the bailiff gag you. My name is not Molly Davis, she said, her voice projecting effortlessly across the silent, stunned courtroom. She reached beneath her collar and pulled out the heavy silver pendant, holding it up so the microscopic camera lens pointed directly at the bench. And I am not resting my case. I am ending yours. Prosecutor Richard Hayes let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Your Honor, what is this? Is she having a psychotic break? Bailiff, Caldwell roared, his composure cracking. Restrain the defendant. Take her to the holding cells immediately. I am declaring a mistrial based on the defendant's sudden psychiatric episode. The bailiff, a heavyset man named Gregory, stepped forward, unclipping his handcuffs. But before he could even cross the span of the well, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom exploded open with a deafening crash. FBI, nobody move. Keep your hands where we can see them. The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. Over a dozen heavily armed tactical agents flooded the aisles, their tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They moved with terrifying, coordinated precision, locking down every exit and establishing a perimeter around the well of the court. What is the meaning of this? Caldwell screamed, rising to his feet, his black robes billowing around him. This is a sovereign state courtroom. I am a superior court judge. I order you to stand down immediately, or I will hold every single one of you in federal contempt. A man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped calmly through the sea of tactical gear. It was Special Agent in charge, Robert Sterling, a veteran of the DOJ's Public Corruption Unit, operating under the direct authorization of FBI Director Christopher Wray. Sterling walked straight up the center aisle, his eyes locked dead on the man behind the bench. "Judge Harrison Caldwell," Sterling said, his voice easily cutting through the panicked shouting of the gallery. "You don't have the authority to hold a parking space, let alone a federal agent." Sterling turned his gaze to the defense table and gave a sharp nod. Sarah smiled, a cold, predatory expression that mirrored the one Caldwell had worn just moments before. She reached into her slacks, retrieved a sleek leather wallet, and flipped it open to reveal a shining gold shield. "Special Agent Sarah Jenkins, Federal Bureau of Investigation," she announced, her voice echoing off the oak panels. "Badge number 449 Alpha 7, and, as of this exact second, Judge Caldwell, you are under arrest for violation of Title 18 U.S.C. Section 241, Conspiracy Against Rights, Title 18 U.S.C. Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under color of law, wire fraud, extortion, and racketeering." Caldwell's face drained of all color. The gavel slipped from his trembling hand, clattering noisily onto the floor. For the first time in his 30-year career, the hanging judge was utterly speechless. He looked from the gold badge in Sarah's hand to the heavily armed agents surrounding his bench, his mind violently rejecting the reality of the situation. This is a setup," Caldwell stammered, his gravelly voice reducing to a pathetic wheeze. "This is entrapment. You fabricated an entire identity. You lied to this court." "We provided an opportunity, Harrison," Sarah corrected, stepping out from behind the defense table. She walked toward the bench, her heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor. "We gave you a fake defendant, fake money, and fake evidence, and you eagerly swallowed the bait. We've been monitoring your courtroom for 8 months. Every sidebar conversation, every illegal instruction to the prosecutor, every envelope of cash you accepted in your chambers." She tapped the silver pendant resting against her chest. "This isn't just a necklace. It's a high-fidelity, encrypted transmitter. Director Ray and the Attorney General's office have been listening to your little kangaroo court live for the last 3 days. They heard you deny valid motions. They heard you threaten my defense attorney. They heard you orchestrate my wrongful conviction in real time." At the prosecution table, Richard Hayes was hyperventilating. He dropped his pen, raised his hands in the air, and began backing away from the table. "I didn't know!" Hayes shrieked, his slick bravado entirely gone. "I swear to God, I didn't know she was an agent. Caldwell forced me to push the forged ledger. I'll cooperate. I want full immunity." "Shut up, Richard!" Detective Bradley Higgins suddenly roared from the witness box. Higgins, realizing the walls had completely closed in, made a desperate, blindingly stupid decision. He vaulted over the wooden railing of the witness stand, sprinting blindly toward the judge's private chamber's door. He didn't make it 3 steps. 2 FBI tactical agents hit him like a freight train, tackling him brutally into the side of the jury box. The wooden paneling splintered under the impact. Higgins hit the floor hard, his nose shattering against the polished oak. In seconds, he was pinned face down, heavy zip ties ratcheting violently around his wrists. "Detective Higgins is secured," an agent barked out. The jury, a collection of 12 terrified citizens, huddled together in the corner of their box, staring in absolute shock as the pillars of their local justice system crumbled into dust before their eyes. Sterling approached the bench, flanked by 2 armed agents. He looked up at the trembling man in the black robe. "Step down from the bench, Harrison. Keep your hands where I can see them." Caldwell didn't move. He seemed physically paralyzed, his pale blue eyes wide with a terror he had only ever inflicted on others. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I am the law in this county. I have friends. I know the governor. I know Senator Mitchell. You are making a terrible mistake." "Your friends have already abandoned you," Sarah said coldly. "We froze your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands 10 minutes ago. We seized the safe deposit box you keep under your sister's name in Chicago. And Senator Mitchell? He's the one who signed the affidavit authorizing our wiretaps after we showed him the evidence of your private prison kickback scheme. You are completely alone. Step down." "Now," Sterling commanded, his hand resting casually on the grip of his sidearm. Slowly, agonizingly, Judge Harrison Caldwell descended the steps of his dais. The aura of invincibility that had shielded him for decades vanished the moment his feet touched the floor. He wasn't a god of the courtroom anymore. He was just an old, corrupt man caught in a lie. "Turn around. Place your hands behind your back." Caldwell squeezed his eyes shut as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The sound was deafening in the quiet courtroom. "Take the robe off," Sarah ordered quietly. Caldwell snapped his eyes open, a flash of his old arrogance flaring up. "You have no right." "I said, take the damn robe off," Sarah repeated, stepping into his personal space, her voice hard as diamond. "You have disgraced it. You don't get to wear it while we march you out of here." An agent stepped forward and roughly pulled the black fabric from Caldwell's shoulders, leaving him standing in his wrinkled dress shirt and suspenders. Stripped of his uniform, he looked incredibly small. As the agents frog-marched Caldwell down the center aisle, past the stunned gallery and the hyperventilating prosecutor, Sarah turned to look at Michael Trent. The public defender was still standing by the table, staring at her with his mouth hanging open. Sarah offered him a small, genuine smile. "You put up a hell of a fight, Mr. Trent. For what it's worth, you're a good lawyer. Keep fighting for the ones who need it." Trent slowly nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. You really had me going. I thought you were going to prison for 15 years. "So did he," Sarah said, watching the courtroom doors swing shut behind the disgraced judge. "But today, the only one getting a mandatory minimum is the man swinging the gavel." 6 weeks later, the heavily fortified interrogation room at the FBI field office in downtown Atlanta smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. The walls were cinder block, painted a depressing, institutional gray. Harrison Caldwell sat at the bolted steel table, chained to the floor by a heavy iron shackle around his ankle. The 30 days he had spent in federal lockup without bail had rapidly aged him. The arrogant, sharp-angled predator was gone. His face was covered in a patchy, graying beard. His skin was sallow, and the manicured fingernails he used to drum on his oak bench were bitten down to the quick. He wore a bright orange jumpsuit with the letters FDC stamped across the back. The heavy metal door clicked and swung open. Sarah Jenkins walked in, carrying a thick accordion file. She didn't wear a cheap cardigan today. She wore a sharp, tailored navy suit, her badge clipped prominently to her belt. She dropped the heavy file onto the table with a loud thud. Caldwell flinched. "Good morning, Harrison," Sarah said, pulling out the steel chair opposite him and sitting down. She opened the file, casually flipping through stacks of printed documents. "I thought I'd bring you an update on your legacy." Caldwell stared at his shackled hands. "I have nothing to say to you without my attorney." "You don't need to say anything," Sarah replied evenly. "I'm just here to deliver the news. Besides, your high-priced defense attorney, Arthur Kensington, just filed a motion to withdraw from your case. It seems since we seized all your illicit assets under the RICO statute, you can no longer afford his $700 an hour retainer. You've been assigned a federal public defender. I believe he graduated law school 3 years ago. You're in great hands." Caldwell's head jerked up, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and absolute panic. "You seized everything?" "My pension." "Revoked under the federal corruption clause," Sarah confirmed, not missing a beat. "The house in the Hamptons, the boat, the offshore accounts, all liquidated. We traced the money directly to the kickbacks you received from the Vanguard Private Correctional Group." She pulled a glossy photograph from the file and slid it across the table. It showed a sprawling, heavily guarded prison complex. "We found the ledgers, Harrison. Not the fake ones Higgins planted in my apartment. The real ones you kept hidden in your encrypted cloud drive. For every 10 inmates you sentenced to a Vanguard facility, you received a $20,000 consulting fee through a shell company. You deliberately targeted minorities and low-income defendants because you knew they couldn't afford the legal representation to fight back. You turned human lives into a commodity to fund your stock portfolio. It was the system," Caldwell rasped, his voice cracking. "I just operated within the parameters of the system. The prosecutors brought me the cases. The police brought the evidence. And you made sure the scales were rigged before the trial even began, Sarah countered, her voice dangerously quiet. You didn't just operate within a broken system, Harrison. You actively poisoned it. But karma has a very specific sense of irony. She pulled out a thick stack of legal briefs, dropping them one by one onto the table in front of him. Let's talk about the fallout, she said. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has officially launched a full-scale audit of your entire 30-year judicial record. Every single conviction you presided over is currently under review by a special appellate panel. Caldwell stared at the mountain of paperwork, his breathing growing shallow. Remember Marcus Johnson? Sarah asked, pointing to the first brief. The young man you sentenced to 20 years for possession of a controlled substance, despite the fact that the dashcam footage magically disappeared before trial. We found the footage in Higgins's private lockbox. It showed the officers planting the drugs. Marcus was exonerated and released yesterday. He's filing a $50 million civil rights lawsuit against the county. She slapped another brief down. David and Maria Torres, you revoked their business license and forced them into bankruptcy to allow a developer friend of yours to buy their property for pennies. The DOJ just indicted your developer friend, and the Torres family is getting their property back with interest. You're dismantling my life's work, Caldwell whispered, genuine tears of self-pity welling in his eyes. Your life's work was a criminal enterprise, Sarah corrected sharply, and we are burning it to the ground. Richard Hayes took a plea deal. He gave up everything. He recorded conversations between the two of you, discussing which defendants were ripe for maximum sentencing to fill the private prison quotas. Detective Higgins flipped, too. He admitted you ordered him to forge the warrant for my arrest. Sarah leaned forward, resting her elbows on the steel table, bringing her face inches from the disgraced judge. But here is the absolute best part, Harrison, the real hard karma. Because of the sheer volume of cases being overturned, the state prison system is facing a massive overcrowding issue as they process the releases and transfers. They had to reorganize the federal holding assignments. Caldwell's eyes widened. What does that mean? It means your pretrial detention facility has been reassigned, Sarah said, a cold satisfaction in her eyes. Tomorrow morning, you are being transferred to the Vanguard Correctional Facility in upstate New York. You are going to be housed in the exact same maximum security private prison you helped fill. You will be assigned a cell block with men whose lives you deliberately destroyed for a paycheck. You will wear their uniform, you will eat their food, and you will live in the cages you built for them. Caldwell recoiled as if he had been physically struck. He grabbed the edges of the steel table, shaking violently. No, you can't put me in general population. I'm a former judge. They'll kill me. I demand protective custody. You'll have to take that up with the warden, Sarah said, standing up and gathering her files. Though, considering the warden is currently under federal investigation for bribing you, I doubt he'll be feeling very charitable. She walked to the heavy metal door and knocked twice. The guard outside unlocked it, pulling it open. Sarah paused in the doorway and looked back at the ruined, pathetic man chained to the floor. The hanging judge had finally met the end of his own rope. You spent 30 years playing God in that courtroom. Harrison, Sarah said, her voice echoing in the sterile room. Welcome to hell. She stepped out into the hallway, the heavy steel door slamming shut with a resounding clang, leaving Judge Harrison Caldwell alone in the suffocating silence of his own making. Vanguard Maximum Security Facility loomed against the gray upstate New York sky like a concrete fortress, a brutalist monument to human misery. Surrounded by triple-layered razor wire and heavily armed watchtowers, it was a place designed to break the human spirit. For Judge Harrison Caldwell, it was the exact facility he had helped populate for over a decade in exchange for offshore kickbacks. Now, he was arriving not in a chauffeured town car for a discreet meeting with Warden Thomas Kessler, but in the back of a heavily armored Department of Corrections transport bus, chained at the wrists, waist, and ankles to 15 other men. The intake process was a masterclass in systematic dehumanization. Caldwell was stripped of his orange federal jumpsuit, forced to stand naked and shivering in a freezing, fluorescent-lit room, while apathetic guards sprayed him down with a harsh, chemical delousing foam. He was given a scratchy, faded green uniform that smelled heavily of industrial bleach and old sweat. "Step up to the line." 814. "Delta," a massive correctional officer barked, pointing a heavy wooden baton at a red strip painted on the concrete floor. "My name is Judge Harrison Caldwell," he stammered, his voice trembling as he clutched the oversized uniform pants to his waist. "I need to speak with the shift captain. I have a pending motion for administrative segregation." The officer stepped forward, closing the distance until his face was inches from Caldwell's. The guard's eyes were dead, utterly devoid of the deference Caldwell had demanded his entire life. "You ain't a judge in here, old man. You are 814, Delta. You speak when spoken to. You walk when told to walk. You understand me? Or do we need to have a physical misunderstanding before you even see your rack?" Caldwell swallowed hard, the last remnants of his arrogance evaporating in the freezing room. "I understand." He was marched down the incredibly long, echoing corridor of C Block. The noise was apocalyptic. It was a cacophony of screaming, metal clanging against metal, and the heavy, oppressive thrum of hundreds of trapped men. As Caldwell walked down the tier, faces pressed against the reinforced steel bars of the cells. Word traveled faster than lightning in a maximum security prison. The guards, many of whom were currently facing internal investigations from the Department of Justice's Office of the Inspector General, OIG, because of the warden's indictment, had absolutely no loyalty left for the disgraced judge. In fact, they had conveniently leaked the roster. "Hey, Your Honor," a voice echoed from an upper tier, followed by a chorus of dark, mocking laughter. "Look who finally made it to the party. 30 years you gave my brother. Caldwell, welcome to the jungle." Caldwell kept his eyes glued to the scuffed linoleum floor, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He was hyperventilating by the time the guard stopped in front of cell 412. The heavy steel door slid open with a mechanical grind. "Inside, 814, Delta," the guard ordered. Caldwell stepped into the tiny, 9 by 6 foot concrete box. The door slammed shut behind him, the locking mechanism engaging with a sickening finality. Sitting on the bottom bunk of the metal bed frame was a man in his late 30s, built like a heavyweight boxer, calmly reading a dog-eared paperback novel. He didn't look up immediately. He slowly turned the page, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. "Excuse me," Caldwell whispered, his voice cracking. I think I'm assigned to the top bunk." The man slowly closed the book. He stood up, towering over the frail, terrified former judge. He stepped into the harsh light filtering through the small, barred window. "Hello, Judge," the man said. His voice was deep, calm, and terrifyingly familiar. Caldwell squinted, his mind racing through thousands of faces he had seen from his elevated bench. Then the blood drained completely from his face. "Terrence," Caldwell breathed, stumbling backward until his spine hit the cold steel of the cell door. "Terrence Gilliard." "You have a good memory," Terrence said, his expression completely unreadable. "Considering I was just one of 20 cases on your docket that Tuesday morning 7 years ago. First-time offense. Nonviolent possession. The prosecutor offered a plea deal for probation and rehab. You rejected it. You said I needed to be made an example of. You gave me the absolute maximum under the mandatory guidelines. 15 years. Terrence, you have to understand," Caldwell pleaded, holding his trembling hands up defensively. "The political climate. The district attorney was pushing for heavy sentences. I was just applying the law." Terrence took a step closer. Caldwell flinched, expecting a physical blow, but Terrence didn't raise a hand. The psychological torture he was about to inflict was far worse than a beating. "You didn't apply the law, Harrison," Terrence said quietly. "You sold me. I know all about the FBI raid. We watched the news in the rec room. You sold my life, my daughter's childhood, and my freedom for a $20,000 kickback from Vanguard. You put me in this exact cage so you could buy a boat." Terrence leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The guards aren't going to help you. The warden is gone. You are completely off the board. You are going to sleep above me every single night. You are going to eat across from me. You are going to watch your back in the showers, in the yard, and in the mess hall. Because every man in this cell block knows exactly who you are and exactly what you did to put them here. Caldwell slid down the steel door, his legs giving out entirely. He pulled his knees to his chest, weeping openly, his fragile ego utterly shattered by the crushing weight of his own karma. He was locked inside the machine he had built, surrounded by the monsters he had created, with absolutely no way out. Hundreds of miles away, in the bright, bustling FBI field office in Atlanta, Special Agent Sarah Jenkins stood in front of a massive corkboard, carefully pulling down photographs and surveillance logs. The operation was officially closed. The fallout from Judge Caldwell's arrest had been biblical. The DOJ's Civil Rights Division had invoked Title 42 U.S.C., Section 1, 1983, allowing thousands of wrongfully convicted citizens to sue the municipality for severe civil rights violations. The resulting financial hemorrhage had forced the state legislature to entirely overhaul the district's judicial system. Corrupt prosecutors had been disbarred. Over 40 police officers from Detective Higgins' precinct were suspended or indicted. Most importantly, the private prison contracts with Vanguard were permanently severed by the governor's office. Sarah grabbed the final piece of evidence from the board, the forged financial ledger Higgins had planted in her fake apartment. She tossed it into the shredder bin. Her unit chief, Robert Sterling, walked into the office, carrying 2 cups of terrible break-room coffee. He handed one to Sarah. "You look entirely too satisfied for a Tuesday," Sterling noted, taking a sip from his cup. "Just cleaning house, boss," Sarah replied, taking the coffee. She looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline, the morning sun reflecting brightly off the glass skyscrapers. "The appellate court just released another batch of Caldwell's convictions," Sterling said, leaning against her desk. 82 non-violent offenders are walking out of state facilities today. Full exonerations. Their records are being completely expunged. Sarah smiled, a genuine, warm expression that had never once appeared on the face of Molly Davis's. "He thought he was invincible because he wore a black robe and sat behind a high desk," Sarah said softly, thinking of the terrified, broken man she had left chained to the interrogation room floor. "He thought the system was his personal weapon." "It was," Sterling agreed, "until he pointed it at you." Sarah turned back to her desk, picking up a brand new case file. The cover was stamped with a red, confidential seal. Another corrupt official. Another predator, hiding behind a badge or a gavel. "They always think they're untouchable," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the new target's profile. She reached up, subconsciously touching the silver pendant resting against her collarbone. "Right up until the moment we put them in the box. Justice is rarely swift, and it is almost never poetic. Yet, when the heavy steel doors of Vanguard Correctional slammed shut, the scales finally balanced. Harrison Caldwell, a man who built an empire on shattered lives and systemic cruelty, became a victim of his own monstrous design. The hanging judge was stripped of his gavel, swallowed whole by the very iron cage he had spent a lifetime relentlessly feeding.